Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Denny Chan, and I'm the Directing Attorney for Equity Advocacy here at Justice and Aging. I'm really pleased to be joined by an exciting group of panelists today who will be talking to us about how legal services and aging services providers can better serve Asian American and Pacific Islander older adults. I'll take a quick minute to introduce my fellow presenters. First is Jun Bang. He is the president and CEO of the National Asian Pacific Center on Aging, NAPCA for short, the nation's only nonprofit organization whose mission is to preserve and promote the dignity, well-being, and quality of life of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and diverse communities as they age countrywide. I also am joined by Kimmy Moon, who serves as the project coordinator at the National Center on Elder Abuse at the Department of Family Medicine at the Keck School of Medicine of USC. A couple of housekeeping issues and introductions. First, we at Justice and Aging, we're a national legal advocacy organization whose mission is to fight senior poverty using the law. And I will turn it over in a little bit for Kimmy and June to introduce their organizations. But about Justice and Aging, we've been founded since 1972 and focused our efforts primarily on those older adults who have been marginalized and excluded from justice, such as women, people of color, LGBT older adults, and older adults with limited English proficiency. You can visit our website, justiceandaging.org, for more information. We also take very seriously at Justice and Aging a commitment to internal diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our mission to fight senior poverty forces us to grapple with the ways in which poverty and racism in this country are intertwined, are interrelated, but also are not synonymous with each other. We have a mission to address the enduring negative effects of that racism and differential treatment by promoting access and equity in all of our program areas: economic security, healthcare, housing, elder rights, and the courts for our nation's low-income older adults. We maintain that commitment internally here at Justice and Aging by recruiting, supporting, and retaining a diverse staff and board, including along many types of diversity: race, ethnicity, gender identity, and presentation, sexual orientation, disability, age, and economic class. Before we get to the bulk of today's content, we do have a couple of logistical notes that frequently come up before we do our webinars. First is that all of you are on mute. So we encourage you, however, to ask questions, substantive questions, and also technical concerns by using the questions tab in the Zoom platform. If you're having difficulty getting onto the webinar, feel free to send an email to trainings@justiceandaging.org. You can also find the materials for this training as well as past trainings by searching the resource library at Justice and Aging's website. In addition, a recording will be posted to our Vimeo page at the conclusion of the presentation. And I know that's often a frequently asked question. Can I get the slides, and how do I get them? So you should be able to access them if you're not already sent them through your email through our resource library. And you can always watch the presentation again. I know that'll be particularly important because at the conclusion of today's presentation, the three of us will be walking through different resources, and you'll want to be able to access those after the training. All right, so what are we going to be talking about today? What are the big topic issues? The first is that we'll give you some background on Asian American and Pacific Islander older adults in particular. We'll talk about and review different tips that we have to better serve AAPI older adults. And then we'll conclude with resources for you all as advocates and professionals, and also get to some of your questions and answers. I will also say, depending on how many questions we get and how much time we have, we might not get to all of your questions today, but we will be leaving our contact information in case you have really urgent questions that you want to make sure that you can follow up with us on. We are bringing you today's presentation for a lot of different reasons. Obviously there has been an alarming number of high-profile attacks against Asian Americans. Our own informal observations here at Justice and Aging indicate that a disproportionate number of those attacks are really targeted against older Asian American women. That is not exclusive. Obviously, there have been other Asian Americans who have been targeted, but really there is something about the disproportionality of the attacks that is specific to the ways in which racism, ageism, and sexism are all working at that specific intersection, and thus creating perhaps a perception or a perceived vulnerability or weakness. The issue of anti-Asian hate, of course, is not new, even though the pandemic and the effects of the rhetoric of the previous administration are new. But the issue of anti-Asian hate is not new and has existed as part of the founding of this country. So we're not going to be delving into deeply on the issue of anti-Asian hate, but I know that that is really one of the reasons that's bringing us together and maybe perhaps motivating some of you. Last month being Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we thought that instead we would take the opportunity in this webinar to highlight different ways that we think legal services and aging services providers can better serve Asian American Pacific Islander older adults. In other words, how might their needs be different or unique compared to other communities of older adults you're serving? How can we do more to improve service delivery, both in aging services and legal services for this specific community? And so with that, I'm going to turn it now over to June, who will introduce NAPCA, as well as followed by Kimmy, who will introduce NCAA.
Hi, it's a real privilege for me to be here. My name is June Bang, the president and CEO of the National Asian Pacific Center on Aging. Our mission is to preserve and promote the dignity, well-being, and quality of life of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as they age. We offer in-language and culturally competent resources and services throughout the country. We are one of 5 minority organizations in the US providing targeted technical assistance and training to the Aging Services Network and other relevant stakeholders and consumers in partnership with the Administration for Community Living. We also advocate for the unique needs of AAPI family caregivers and diverse AAPI representation and research. One project in particular of note is the CARE project. We've partnered with the University of California, San Francisco to develop the very first research registry for serving AAPI communities throughout the country. And also the Compass Project. Denny mentioned the increase in anti-Asian hate targeting our communities. And the Compass Project, the purpose of the study was to gather input and to learn about the experiences of our communities throughout the country. And we've had about 5,000 plus participants in the study share with us their experience. And just a few facts from what we've learned from the study is that 3 in 5 of the participants have expressed that they've experienced discrimination in the past 6 months. And 59% of them felt as though the country has become more dangerous for their ethnic group. We also support America's mature workforce and support our older adults with building economic security through our Senior Community Service Employment Program in partnership with the Department of Labor and the Senior Environmental Employment Program in partnership with the EPA. In the 41 years of our organization's history, we've supported over 100 older adults throughout the country. Our offices are located in Los Angeles, Seattle, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. And our workforce development programs serve a diverse population in over 16 states.
Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you Justice and Aging really for hosting this wonderful event and really having us be part of this important conversation. Again, my name is Kimmy Moon and I serve as project coordinator at the National Center on Elder Abuse, or NCEA, which is a national resource center dedicated to the empowerment of older adults and the prevention of elder mistreatment. We are also funded by the Administration for Community Living and situated within the Department of Family Medicine at the Keck School of Medicine of USC. And I do want to mention in my personal time, I also serve as a Korean language bank volunteer at a sexual assault and a domestic violence prevention program serving AAPI communities and survivors and families here in LA. So back to the NCEA, we really strive to improve the national response to elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And of course, we are all aging, and elder abuse really does impact all of us on some level. So at the NCEA, we educate both public and professional audiences, share the latest information and research and national policy, and promote best practices in the field. So now I'll just hand it off back to June to provide us with some important background information on AAPI older adults.
Awesome. And I think in order to understand the needs of our Asian American Pacific Islander older adults, it's important to recognize and learn about the diversity that exists within our communities. AAPIs are a heterogeneous group representing diverse and unique cultural and racial identities originating from over 30 countries in the Asian continent or the Pacific Islands. Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group in the US, making up 7% of the total population, of which 20 million are Asian Americans and 1.6 million are Pacific Islanders. AAPIs 65 plus are expected to grow by 232% to 7.3 million, representing 21% of the total AAPI population by 2060. And our AAPI older adults make up about 4.6% of the total US older adult population and about 10.2% of the total AAPI population. Now, language access is one of the fundamental pieces in serving our older adults because AAPIs represent over 100 spoken languages. And about 60% of Asian older adults are limited English proficient. Or, in other words, they speak English less than very well. Or we can also go a step further and say that they might have some language barriers. Now, 27% of AAPI older adults reside in linguistically isolated households. A third of all Cambodian, Laotian, and Chinese American older adults, 45% of Korean American older adults, and 46% of Vietnamese American older adults are linguistically isolated. And language barriers can lead to isolation, loss of opportunities, prevent someone from medical and social services, and has a direct impact on quality of life. A little information about poverty and the economic status of our communities. In aggregate, AAPI older adults face lower levels of poverty compared to other minority counterparts. However, within certain AAPI subpopulations, poverty rates are extremely high. A quarter of all Micronesian older adults, a fifth of Bangladeshi, Burmese, Cambodian, Korean, and Nepalese older adults, and 15% or more of Chinese, Hmong, Laotian, and Vietnamese older adults live in poverty today. On to health disparities. Our older adults experience worse access to care than white Americans by 17% and worse care by 30%. They have disproportionately high prevalence of hepatitis B, tuberculosis, and dementia. And out of all women in the United States, AAPI women who are 65 and older have the highest suicide rate in the country. And our older adults are more likely to be uninsured compared to the total US population. And only 33% of Asian American older adults have private insurance compared to 52% of all American older adults. 1 in 7 Tongan, Pakistani, Bangladeshi older adults are currently uninsured. Now, what happens when all of these challenges and barriers collide? It leaves many of our AAPI older adults in a position where they are unable to overcome the linguistic, social, economic, and health inequities in a broken system. And I say broken because the current system is not in favor of serving our AAPI older adults. Now, I want to share with you an encounter I had over 3 years ago that changed my life. And the reason behind why I joined NAPCA. I received a call from the county hospital in Los Angeles, and they had shared with me that they had a Korean grandmother in her late 70s in their care. Now, a little context behind how the grandmother got there. She was in a studio apartment in Koreatown and could no longer afford the rent and was evicted from her own. She ended up sleeping outdoors in front of the apartment building, and her neighbors had called the police on her, and the police had taken her down to the county hospital. And so the county hospital gave me a call and asked if I could come down and have a conversation with this grandmother. And when I got there, one of the very first things that she said or expressed to me was that she was afraid to be there because no one was able to communicate with her, and she was unable to communicate with anyone there. I had the opportunity to speak, to reach out to her relatives who served as her caregivers for a period of time, and they had given up. They were unable to overcome their own financial burdens. And eventually, a few weeks later, I received a call from the county hospital letting me know that they had no choice but to give the grandmother a bus token. And eventually, the grandmother became a part of the growing population in Los Angeles of unhomed or unhoused individuals. Now, I think it's important to look at this encounter from different angles. And we have to look at it from the beginning of evaluating the institution of this hospital that is there to serve the county. Now, for all of us, LA County is considered one of the most or best resourced or the best resourced counties in the country. And when you consider the fact that the institution or the healthcare provider, the hospital, didn't have a culturally or linguistically appropriate program or service or staff to support one individual, I think it speaks volumes to the condition of our systems today. And then we have to look at the caregivers. The caregivers themselves were unaware of the services and the supports that they could have received. But then it lends to the question of whether caregiving services in the country today are actually being implemented in a way where communities of color and communities that have historically not had access to resources, if these programs are considering their needs as well. And then lastly, we have to think about the older adult who ended up falling through the cracks because she did not have the resources and the support that she needed to live and age with dignity in this country. Next slide. Next slide, please. So there is, in all of this, in our conversation, there is a significant importance of cultural awareness. Now, cultural awareness is the first and foundational element of cultural competence. And cultural awareness is defined as being cognizant, observant, and conscious of similarities and differences among cultural groups, and understanding that one's culture may influence values, beliefs, judgments, or decisions. Now, historically, AAPI cultures are highly group-oriented and place a strong emphasis on the family as a sole source of identity. The traditional household is comprised of multiple generations. It is normal to find 3 or 4 generations living under one roof, and AAPIs often value the family unit over oneself. An example is the native Hawaiian term panai, which has a loose meaning of adoption or to take into one's family. But in its simplest meaning, panai is a person that is considered a family member. And loyalty to one's family is highly regarded. And independent behavior that may disrupt the harmony of the family is discouraged. And then there's the importance of filial piety, meaning there is a primary duty of respect, obedience, and care for elderly parents or relatives. And it's really important for our cultures. Now, AARP reinforced this value by reporting that AAPIs are significantly more likely to take charge of caregiving duties as compared to other ethnic groups. Next slide. Now, language, culture, identity, and community go hand in hand. And at NAPCA, we believe that language is the embodiment of culture, history, and identity. And ultimately, in its purest form, language is power. And all throughout history, we have seen language be used to both deny and acquire power. Which is why when we consider all the challenges that our older adults, our elders experience with language access in America, it is important for all of us to not only acknowledge that there are inequities that have significant impact on our older adults. And one example of that is the pandemic. There was a report done by Quartz, and the title of this report is "The US Communities Hit Hardest by COVID-19 Are Also the Most Ignored." And if I were to edit this title, I would call it "The US Communities Hit Hardest by COVID-19 Are Also the Most Ignored and the Most Powerless." And for a country that values equality and equity and standing for vulnerable populations, I think what the pandemic has revealed to us is that the system in which we all operate and serve elders from diverse communities is largely broken. Next slide. A little bit about cultural competence, best practices. I think, I've listed 5 here, but I think we can summarize all of these best practices into the first one, which is acknowledge and recognize the challenges of AAPI older adults, and we need to care about them. To give you an example, I had a conversation with one of the biggest foundations in the country. And in that conversation, I asked them if they were thinking through grant making to support agencies and organizations that care for AAPI elders. And their response was that they weren't thinking about that because they didn't believe or know that AAPI elders needed support of any kind. And that is the sad reality of where we are in the country. But I think there are small steps that we can take, that we can all take to begin to elevate and be more intentional about serving our elders. And so best practice number 2 would be to value AAPI diversity. I've shared with all of you about the richness of the diversity that exists within our communities. And I think organizations can value AAPI diversity by fostering a multicultural and age-diverse work environment, target funding for services, and ensure resource allocation to match the needs of AAPI older adults and their caregivers. Assess your organization. Develop an internal team to conduct regular organizational assessments to evaluate operational impacts on AAPI older adults. Assess policies and procedures, like developing a system to collect disaggregated AAPI data, or ensure a process of identifying and documenting preferred language of the people we serve. Manage the dynamics of difference, meaning consider implementing a mechanism for our AAPI older adults and their families to provide feedback, and to incorporate that feedback back into the systems and the programs and the policies that exist within our organizations. Solicit input from AAPI staff in organizational planning for AAPI older adults. And lastly, acquire and institutionalize AAPI cultural knowledge. Identify opportunity for staff to learn about AAPI cultures through regular cultural competency trainings.
Thanks, June. This is Denny again from Justice and Aging. I want to thank you for getting us started and doing the review on, different sort of statistics and issues within the Asian American Pacific Islander older adult community, and for also getting us started on tips. I'm going to continue with a couple of tips that really fall in line with a lot of June's earlier comments and based on information that he reviewed. The first is really for legal services and aging services providers to put a primary emphasis on language access. And here I tried to italicize the word access. I'm not sure if that really shows up on your screen or if you can really tell. And what I mean by focusing on language access is obviously, having interpretation and translation services available for the Asian American Pacific Islander older adults who you serve because of the overwhelmingly high rates of limited English proficiency in that subpopulation. And so obviously you want to have, review and implement policies to ensure that those clients have appropriate language access services. That includes, in our opinion, creating and maintaining a language access plan. In that plan, documenting details like the types of interpretation and translation services you provide, and what the needs of the local community are, what the different language needs are. There sometimes, unfortunately, though, that's not where the sort of focus on language access should end. In fact, the focus on language access should really be about whether the AAPI older adult clients actually understand what you're communicating. And so it's not necessarily a focus on the technical word for word translation or interpretation, although those things are important, but really about the underlying meaning in those documents or in those statements. We also think it's really important to use bilingual staff who are qualified. We see this in many different types of settings, not specific to older adults, aging services and legal services, but generally across the board, there can be a lot of sometimes pressure or convenience to use bilingual staff, but those bilingual staff may or may not have the training and competency to interpret or to translate. They might have a working level knowledge, or they might have, a knowledge of the language, the Asian American Pacific Islander language that they used at home with family, but that doesn't necessarily qualify them to do legal interpretation or do medical interpretation. So really placing an emphasis on using those staff who are qualified. And then I think it's important to keep in mind when you're working with interpreters and translators that AAPI older adults may not share as comfortably. And so you'll need to incorporate, practices to encourage them to share. A lot of times, in working on language access here at Justice and Aging, we've come across many situations where older adults will actually want to use the family member who's not qualified and want to use either the son or the daughter or the granddaughter or the grandchild. And that's fine. There's not a prohibition against that. But we also want to make sure when that older adult is making their preference, that they also know that language access is a right, that they have a right to free, timely, qualified interpretation services, and we don't have to rely on family members who may or may not do a good job in that interpretation or translation. Similarly to what June said before about the diversity within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, we would encourage legal services and aging services providers to collect and disaggregate client data for specific subgroups. Just like June laid out, the needs of this particularly diverse community can vary depending on subpopulation. And so really not just having an overall bucket that identifies the client as Asian American or Pacific Islander, but also that drills down, because I think that's where you will start to see some potential issues or case trends in a way that lumping everyone together really renders it much more difficult to see some of those smaller issues bubble up with specific clients. We also think it's important that in striving to better serve Asian American, Pacific Islander older adults, that organizations take a look internally. And June had mentioned something along these lines, but to really prioritize recruitment and retention of a diverse staff that includes Asian American, Pacific Islander employees. We'll talk a little bit on the next slide about partnerships with community-based organizations, but really thinking through, would Asian American, Pacific Islander older adults even feel comfortable getting services at an agency where the staff don't resemble them, don't have cultural competency, don't have the language competency? That will be a barrier in being able to provide services to this specific community. And then, of course, we would encourage legal services providers in particular, when thinking about cases and doing your sort of weekly or regular case reporting, to think about cases with an intersectional approach in mind. And that means both having a lens that you're thinking about aging issues and race issues, because that's often where we see unique or specific impacts. There was a lot of emphasis in the last month because of Heritage Month on the needs of Asian American Pacific Islanders. Some of those are going to be more or less or different depending on whether you're talking about older adults in that community. So really to think when you're doing case review and looking for different case trends, to look at it with that sort of framework in mind. I'd also said, we talk about partnering with community-based organizations. The role of community-based organizations in the AAPI community and in many communities of color is that these are the trusted messengers. Whether you're talking about vaccine access, whether you're talking about COVID-19 information, whether you're talking about information about public benefits, these community-based organizations have been around for decades, sometimes even more than that, and have a role in lifting up and providing services to local communities in a way that legal services and sometimes aging services providers don't necessarily have those relationships. So it's really important that when you're thinking about better serving Asian American and Pacific Islander older adults, to work with those community-based organizations who do have the trust, who do have the cultural competency, who have been working with these communities for many, many years. We would encourage you to think about different ways to create ways for robust collaboration. And this is, beyond just the I know so-and-so at that CBO, or I know who does the case management work at that CBO. But to think about, are there ways to actually make that a more robust collaboration? So it's not just sometimes passive client referral, but it could be setting up, for example, mobile clinics, legal services clinics or other types of clinics. It could be a way of strengthening those relationships and the visibility of the aging services that you provide or the legal services that you provide. I also think it's really important when working with these CBOs to have them help you and have them help you in a way that is, I think, specific to many immigrant communities that have come from other countries that don't have historical roots in legal services or don't have historical roots in aging services. Oftentimes there's a lot of even confusion about how you would explain what those concepts and what those services are to older adults. When you're talking about immigrant communities, some of whom, and we'll talk a little bit about trauma-informed practices next, but when you're talking about immigrant communities who have come from their home countries or countries of origin that have particular histories around government, around insurrection, around political instability, they might not be initially inclined to receive services from government or people who they perceive as associated with government. There might be actually a certain degree of mistrust in specific communities. So it'll really take the partnership with CBOs to be able to explain even what are legal services to begin with. These are things that aren't a substandard or aren't necessarily part of government, should be trusted. Just like you would explain aging services in the same way. These are not concepts that necessarily exist in their countries of origin or don't necessarily exist in their countries of origin at the time they immigrated, and are really important to unpack if you want your clients to understand and work with you. Along a similar line, there's a really growing amount of recognition behind the importance of trauma-informed practices, whether that's in aging services or in legal services. It is so important to recognize the significance of childhood trauma, historical trauma, racial trauma. And so we would encourage you to think through and think proactively about providing accommodations, for example, in client interviewing, or when preparing a client, an older adult, Asian American, Pacific Islander older adult, through extensive witness preparation to alleviate anxiety. It's also important, of course, although we're not making it the focus of today's presentation, to think about the impact of current Asian American hate and the rhetoric that this particular community has been the subject of, especially with the COVID-19 virus. We've heard from a lot of older adults that they either won't get vaccinated because they're afraid to go out of their homes because of the possibility of being attacked. We've also heard that even those who have been vaccinated from COVID-19 continue to stay at home because it is an unsafe environment, or they perceive their safety to be at risk in an outdoor, even a sometimes public setting. All of those have serious repercussions on the health and the well-being and the vitality of these communities and the older adults in these communities. So to think through how we even provide services and recognition of that trauma in an ongoing way. And that will ultimately give clients power and control back over their cases and lives. We're gonna now turn to resources before we get to some of your questions and answers in a little bit. And I wanted to kick us off with additional resources that we have here, either at Justice and Aging. I should have said in our introduction that Justice and Aging, also through support from the Administration on Community Living, runs the National Center on Law and Elder Rights. Here we have a number of resources that we think could be really important and helpful to you all as you're serving Asian American, Pacific Islander older adults and thinking about how to better serve them. This is not an inclusive list, an all-inclusive list, but really an area for you to get started. We have additional resources, for example, on trauma-informed lawyering, on access to public benefits for older adults, certainly on language access rights, where language access is indeed a legally protected right. And so how do we think about those rights as they pertain to LAP older adults? And specifically with respect to the Social Security Administration, we have a resource about accessing Social Security Administration services for LAP individuals. That's all available on the NICLA website. And when you get these slides, you can click, they've been hyperlinked here. And will get you started thinking about ways in which your practice, your service delivery can really better meet the needs and the specific concerns that Asian American, Pacific Islander older adults are experiencing and have faced. I'll also note that these resources are not AAPI specific. And so there's a little bit of irony in me recommending them here, but I'll also recommend that, I'll also say to that we, work across many different populations of older adults. And I think that these in particular are resources that speak specifically to that intersectionality we've been talking about. What are the specific and unique needs for AAPI older adults? And they might also apply to other older adults as well, but certainly are not exclusive of what AAPI older adults might be experiencing. We also, during COVID-19 at Justice and Aging, have issued and have written a number of blog posts about COVID and how that might be impacting particular AAPI older adults and others. And so I'd encourage you to read those. A lot of those are about COVID-19 response or how the vaccines have been rolling out. But the principles like community-based partnership around language access and ensuring that people actually understand what it is that they're getting services for. All those are principal considerations, regardless of whether you're talking about COVID-19 or something else. So I'd really encourage you to look at those additional resources and of course, ask us if you have questions. With that, I'm gonna turn it over to Kimmy, who will also have some practice tips and some resources for you as well.
Thanks, Denny. So Denny and June really already shared so many wonderful practice tips. So I'll just reiterate some points and just share a little bit about what the NCA has done. So again, it's just so important to form those connections with local interpreters and translators. And if possible, again, just really working with interpreters that are trained to use a trauma-informed approach. Providing language access is just the beginning. And as Denny mentioned with AAPI older adults, they may not share as comfortably with professional interpreters, which is why, again, it's so important to have bilingual and bicultural staff on your team. But if that's not available to you and you use a contracted partner or service regularly, ask them how they're using trauma-informed practices and offer trainings as well. Another tip that we have in terms of translations is to create a glossary of commonly used terms and phrases and share that with your interpreter and translator. Have that as part of your language access plan that Denny mentioned, so that you can ensure consistency and acceptability. So internally, we have this large Excel sheet that includes all this information. Some of the other tips mentioned on the slide, Denny and June really went over. But when it comes to materials, of course, we always want to consider the consumer's varying literacy levels in both English and in language fact sheets. So when translating a document, it's really important that the original text is written in plain language so that you can translate that into plain language again, but don't always assume that that's going to be the case. So please do double check that the translated materials reflect that same reading level. Next slide, please. So the first scholarly article focused on elder abuse was published in 1975. So when compared with other fields within interpersonal violence, elder abuse research is relatively new. And when it comes to research on elder abuse within diverse communities, the information is even more limited. So at the NCEA, we do synthesize and disseminate research on elder abuse to encourage the translation of this information into practice. So here I have linked our research briefs for you to read and explore. We also have a long list of research briefs on various topics and populations, but our newest pieces concerning our AAPI communities are the mistreatment of Chinese elders and mistreatment of Korean elders brief. We are also in the process of revamping our mistreatment of AAPI elders research brief that was originally published in 2013. So we really hope that this information will help you better engage with and effectively serve AAPI older adults. However, as June and Denny mentioned, I just again want to remind you all of the beautiful diversity and heterogeneity within AAPI groups. So please keep in mind that the information presented here is just based on available research. So please be cautious about generalizing any of these findings. Next slide, please. So here's just a slide of some of our most popular fact sheets. We have them available in multiple languages, Spanish, also Farsi, and Russian, I believe. So please do visit our publications page linked on this website. If you would like physical copies of any of these, please do reach out to me. I'll have my contact information in the chat and then also at the end of this presentation, and we'll try our very best to accommodate your requests. Next slide. So as June mentioned, there are cultural values, beliefs, and behaviors that really create barriers for AAPI older adults to reach out for help and seek services. So the NCEA, a couple years ago, we partnered with NAPCA to produce a series of elder financial exploitation materials in various different Asian languages, as you can see on the slide. My favorite resource actually that came out of the series is the guidelines for professionals with best practices information on really how to use these and share these resources effectively. Then again, we joined forces to provide information on how AAPI caregivers, especially those caring for people living with dementia, can better take care of themselves given the physical and emotional difficulties that can arise from providing care. So again, all of these resources are available on our website that's linked on this slide. And with that, I'll turn it over to June for some additional resources.
Thank you, Kimmy. So if you go to our website, www.napca.org, or napga.org/resource, we have a number of resources where agencies and professionals can download to learn more about our communities. We have the AAPI toolkit, we have a diversity guide, as well as fact sheets that might be supportive in your service to our Asian American Pacific Islander older adults. We also have a in-language helpline that serves the country in multiple languages. And so, we do not provide counseling services or legal services through our helpline, but we do help make referrals as well as support older adults and their caregivers gain access to information towards resources. So I highly recommend visiting our website or giving our helpline a call should you need support.
All right, I want to first thank my co-panelists, June and Kimmy, for an interesting and I hope informative webinar. And now it's time for questions. And so I know a number of you have been writing to us in using the Q&A function. It's not too late. We have about 10 minutes left for questions here. I first want to start off by thanking Terry, who said, if you don't have an employee, and this is a tip I think Terry is suggesting, if you don't have an employee who speaks the language, you can partner with an agency that can speak the language. And I think that's another really good example of how those community-based partnerships with CBOs is really, really important. I also had a couple of other thoughts before I get into questions that I see people and give people some time to type, is that we at Justice and Aging earlier this year in February did file a lawsuit against the US government for specific changes they made last year that essentially diluted or watered down language access rights in healthcare. And so if you know of older adults who you work with, Asian American or other LAP older adults, who have had barriers in healthcare because of their language, because of language barriers, because of the failure to get an interpreter, because of something being poorly interpreted or English only, please let us know. My email is here, dchan@justiceandaging.org, because we'd be very interested in talking to people and learning more about their experiences for purposes of the litigation that we filed. I also wanted to add one suggestion, which I should have articulated, I think, more clearly before, but that I thought of really in response to what Kimmy was saying around having a glossary and the importance of responding to both literacy in English as well as literacy in someone's home language or someone's native language. And that's the importance of testing the translations that either you or community-based organizations who you partner with come up with. And just as an example of why that's so important is a couple of years ago in our advocacy here in California, the state did not do some of that testing. They had a vendor who did the translations and everything word for word made a lot of sense. But then when it actually was read by consumers, those translations didn't make a lot of sense to them. And that's ultimately the importance behind the access piece, the language access piece. And the access piece and language access is that you want people to understand what you're communicating. And so to the extent that I think June had said, how do you incorporate AAPI older adults into their feedback into your policies and organizational culture and practices? That's a big one, is that if the materials you are intending for them to really be able to use, that they aren't able to actually understand it, then it's important to get that feedback and work with interpreters and translators who you're able to get that message across. All right, so as questions come in, I'm going to kick it off for a question for both of our panelists today. And we had over 300 people on today's webinar, which is one of the first kinds of webinars that we've done like this at Justice and Aging, focused really on AAPI older adults, low-income AAPI older adults. And I wanted to ask both June and Kimmy their thoughts, for those people who are still listening, what's one takeaway you want them to leave with? We've given them a lot of advice. We've given them a lot of tips and suggestions. If you had to whittle it down to one takeaway, what would it be and why? Maybe we'll start with June.
Thanks, Danny. I would say the biggest takeaway is that there has been this misconception, and we call it the model minority myth, that our communities, by and large, don't need the same types of support or services as other communities, and that's just not true. When you look at all the information that all three of us have presented for participants on this webinar, it's clear that services are really important for our elders, and the fact that they need to be culturally and linguistically appropriate services.
Kimmy, what are your thoughts?
That's a great question, Denny. I would like to just say, when we talk about cultural barriers, I think that we only think about the negative aspects, but I encourage you all to really try to reframe that into, what are the opportunities? What are the barriers, but what are the challenges, but how do we overcome that? What can the community do to come together to respond to those needs? And really focus more on the assets and what you can get out of that in terms of barriers, quote unquote.
Thank you. So I'm going to take one of these questions and see how much time we have for the rest of them. The first one comes to us from Joyce. So Joyce says that they are a service provider located in the Central Valley here in California, and they have a mix of Asian Americans in their community, more Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Chinese clients in particular. And they want to translate their brochure into an Asian language that can be used for those clients. What language do you recommend? And do you know of a translation service that works with legal aid? June, why don't you start off and then we can go to Kimmy if she has additional thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a great question. I would, I mean, I don't know your organization, but I think the first step would be to reach out to the local organizations that might have direct service to some of these populations that are coming to your organization for support, because a lot of these organizations, nonprofit organizations, might have translation services or interpretation services and are closer to the communities themselves. If you're looking for a direct translating service, we've worked with a group out in Los Angeles called Pals for Health. You might want to reach out to them. I think they're kind of nonprofit based, but I would also recommend that you might want to convene a focus group with the people that you serve in these languages and get their feedback. I think that's one of the things that are really important, to include the people you serve in the communities that you're supporting by getting feedback directly from them as well.
Thanks, June. Kimmy, any additional insights into Joyce's question?
No, yeah, I think June pretty much covered everything, but I would say if there is a service in your area, just ask them, because as an organization that provides interpretation and translations, I think they would have some idea of the needs in the community, so reach out to them.
Great, thank you. I also wanted to turn, I was the one who mentioned the change in the law as the attorney on the webinar today. Regarding translators in healthcare, and I'll just sort of say it very briefly because it is potentially its own webinar, the topic of its own webinar. But that in August of last year, the previous administration finalized changes that essentially watered down, as I said, or made it more difficult for people to be aware of their language access rights in healthcare specifically, taking away requirements around notice, in particular, and what we call taglines, which are short statements indicating to people that they have that free interpretation services are available. That's often, if you think about how people receive this, it's often a one page attached to a notice or a document from your healthcare company with various languages and numbers to call in case you speak those languages. So those that used to be required to be part of important communications were no longer required starting in August of last year. So that's specifically the change. And then there's a couple of other questions. We'll see how many we can get to. There's one question here about the appropriateness of Google Translate to translate materials. Kimmy, why don't we start with you, since we started with June a couple of times. What are your thoughts on using Google Translate? And then we can get June if he has additional insights.
Sure, yeah. I think Google Translate, if you are just trying to quickly translate something to try to get the gist of what the message is about, that's okay, but definitely do not rely on it 100%. Definitely you want to work with trained translators, interpreters that are, again, trained to provide the service, because Google's not trained for that.
And June, any additional answers to this question on Google Translate?
Yeah, I would just ditto Kimmy's response. You know, our website has the capacity to utilize the same type of software that Google Translate uses to translate our page. But again, it's not, you know, to Kimmy's point, it's not, there's going to be a loss of in translation and the nuances that are important that factor in the cultural parts of language might get missed out. So use it as a, you know, as a resource, but I wouldn't put 100% confidence in it.
Yeah, I think it's important to think through kind of what you're using it for. You know, if it's like I think Google Translate is really helpful for something really quick if you're looking for word kind of translations. But to both of, you know, Kimmy and June's points, some of that overall meaning, unfortunately, the algorithms are not as sophisticated in always capturing that. So really keep that in mind and thinking through the why. There's a question here also from Larry. I was the one who brought up trauma-informed practices. And so Larry asks, can you give some examples of trauma-informed practices with AAPI older adults in particular? And I think that's a really good question. I had talked before about, if we get to that slide, let's see. You know, examples being providing accommodation for client interviewing, extensive witness prep for alleviating anxiety. Those are general trauma-informed practices. I think when you're thinking about Asian American Pacific Islander older adults in particular, you can think through and really try and whittle down where trauma may have occurred in their lifetime. And that might look different depending on what kind of AAPI older adult or who on the other end in the AAPI older adult you're working with. You know, for example, many Southeast Asian older adults are coming from a historical trauma, have historical trauma around war, around government. All of that would really need to be taken into account when you're working with that older adult. Their ability to freely open up about specific issues if they perceive you as part of government, or if they don't understand your role in helping them be an advocate. You know, we've said in our trauma-informed practicing series that oftentimes these practices don't cost a lot of money, but they take more time. And that's, you know, if you think about time as money, then maybe it does cost something, but it is really important really to be able to serve those older adults who are coming into it with a different perspective than other older adults might have. So with that, I think we're at the end of our hour. I want to give a big thank you to both June and Kimmy for taking on this webinar with us here at Justice and Aging. I want to thank all of you for participating till the very end. There are a number of questions we didn't get to. You should feel free to contact us offline. Our contact information is here, and we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you so much and have a good rest of your day.